All right, everyone, welcome to the most recent episode 26 of the Black and Intellectual live stream show. Give me 1 second to make sure everything is working properly. Give me 1 second. Looks like everything is good to go. Everything should be good on my end. If you are having trouble hearing me, just let me know. Looks like everything is good to go. Everything should be good on my end. Okay. So yeah, everything sounds good. So, I didn't do a show last week, but I'm doing one this week, and actually I have two things I'm doing today. I have the live stream show that I'm doing, but I also have an interview. Now, the interview is going to be later on this evening, and it's going to be pre-recorded, so it's not going to be live. But definitely be on the lookout for that as well. Now, the topic of today's show. Let me put something into the chat really quick. Hold on 1 second. All right, I'm just adding something to the chat. Let me add something to the chat on Periscope. Show. Let me put. All right, so let me continue. So today's show is, as you can see from the scroll, that the headline that's scrolling across the screen. Today's show is titled "The System of Slavery," and this is a part one. This is something that I have realized over the past few days, something that needs to be discussed in a lot of details, with a lot of detail, using not just one book, but using several books, using several sources. I want to try to get an interview set up over the next couple weeks, not this week, but probably over the next week or two, with a scholar, a particular scholar who is very knowledgeable of this topic, because I've realized, because of the Kanye West situation, I've realized that we actually do need to have a discussion about this. Because some of us know this information, but a lot of us don't, unfortunately. And this show isn't going to be about Kanye. I'm going to mention Kanye maybe a few times, but it's really just going to be to disprove everything that he stated. Um, and I realized that we can't assume that everybody knows this information. And what's really dangerous about what's going on right now is it's a continuation of a very dismissive agenda of the history of slavery in America, promoted most of the time historically by white Americans, but even more so, you're seeing a lot of black Americans who just don't know this history and haven't been properly taught this history. You're seeing them echo this same dismissiveness. So what am I talking about exactly? We cannot ignore the power of the subversive energy of black collaborators to white supremacy. Okay. And one of the reasons why I'm not really focusing on Kanye today is because, first of all, check out my video on the Progressive Army, Benjamin Dixon's channel. I did a whole, 30-something minute show on his channel, on his platform, about my opinions about Kanye, but there wasn't really a lot of historical data about slavery in that video because that wasn't really the point of the video. And I feel like a lot of people have given their opinions on this, so I don't want to make just another video repeating stuff I already said in the previous video and repeating stuff you've heard other people say already. You know what I'm saying? So this video is purely just about history. This is a historically driven video. Okay, I will be pulling from data from one of the best books I've ever read. Now, there are a lot of really good books I've read about slavery. I'm not going to go into each one of those books this week. I will roll out those books over the course of several weeks. I've read books on slave rebellions. I've read books on slavery itself. This is a history that we need to know, and we need to know it better than anybody else. But we cannot, like I said, we cannot ignore the power of the subversive energy of these black collaborators. That's why I did a whole video specifically about black collaborators. A lot of people like to use the word coon. I'm not the biggest fan of that word, but those are the people I'm talking about. Okay, you see, right now, that spirit of rebellion is very strong in the black community. Okay, the spirit of rebellion, the spirit of resistance is very strong in the black community right now. And all throughout history, when that rebellious energy, that revolutionary energy bubbled to the top, you always had some sellout, some collaborator who subverted everything we were doing so that they could get some trinkets. Maybe an extra plate of food, maybe one last lash of the whip. Whatever the case may be, there was some sort of incentive. Okay, some sort of incentive historically that certain black people have had to collaborate with white supremacists to subvert the rebellious spirit and the rebellious revolutionary energy in the black community whenever we got to a point where we were like, enough is enough. And we cannot think that just because we're living in a current modern age, then that dynamic is somehow different, because it's not. People are still making decisions akin to the slave plantation. People are making decisions where they're like, okay, I'm in a disadvantaged position, or I want to achieve something financially, or in the slavery days, it wasn't even necessarily financially all the time. But there's something that I need, or something that I need to protect myself from. So I'm going to throw the entire community under the bus to protect my own ass. It was true in 1790, and it's true in 2018. So we have to be mindful historically about the moment we're in right now, and how that field slave versus house slave, rebellious and resistant black energy versus the negative energy of the black collaborators, how these dynamics are still very much in play even in 2018. All right, 2008, we cannot afford to not take this seriously. That's really just not an option. So I don't see this as being a, quote, free speech or quote free thought issue where we just say, oh, well, I don't know. Kanye has the right to his own opinion and just leave it at that. As if all we're dealing with right now are just empty words and empty rhetoric. No, Kanye is gaslighting the black community so that he can get money from racist people, okay, who like the fact that he's gaslighting the black community. He can get money from these racist people, and we should feel some type of way about our history essentially being pissed on so that one man can make a buck and be some sort of modern day step and fetch it. Okay, we should feel some type of way about that because it is us it's our community that's being used like this and being used for this political agenda. Hold on one second. Let me I want to retweet this because this is what I'm going to get into today. What I'm going to get into today is going to be the tip of the iceberg. The data and the history that I'm going to read to you today, some of you might not know about, some of you might know about. Okay, but what I do know is this. What I'm going to read to you today, you won't find in any school textbooks. All right? You won't find many places across the internet. You won't find a lot of people repeat a lot of this stuff because there is a concerted effort to hide this data that I'm going to reveal to you guys today. And I'm gonna tell you the book that I'm reading from in a second. So this is a very important episode 26. We're getting knee deep into the history, and we're not doing it through a movie. I know a lot of people are tired of slave films, and to be honest with you, I'm a little tired of slave movies and slave TV shows myself. Okay, unless I see a slave movie that shows this stuff. The stuff that I'm about to go over. Okay, I want to see a slave film about some of this stuff that I'm going to go over in a second. So before I get started, I want to add that as hard as the history of slavery is to recount for some African Americans because of how diabolical and harsh it was, this is our history. This is the history of our people. Okay, whether it's hard to admit to it or not, I mean, it is what it is. We can't change the past. This is the history of Black America. All right, this is the post-African history of African Americans, of Black America. We shouldn't run away from it because we should actually embrace it. We should embrace it. We should study it. And like I said earlier, we should know it better than anyone else because when we allow ourselves to be told to forget it, when we listen to these people, these outsiders, these colonizers, to use a Black Panther reference, when we allow these outsiders to come in and tell us to forget the past, to forget the history, oh, slavery happened a long time ago, why are you still talking about slavery? When we allow people to whitewash history like that, and we buy into that, there is a price to be paid for that. And as I'm about to show in a second, that price is usually the sanitization of our history, which is something that many white Americans have been doing for generations. I mean, I'm not pulling any punches today. I'm not, beating around the bush. I'm just speaking on facts. Okay? So let's begin. Let us begin. The book that I am reading is a book that I have, or reading from, is a book that I have mentioned several times in the past across several videos. Now, some of you guys might not have seen those videos, so I'm just going to repeat the title of the book. The book is called The Half Has Never Been Told: Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. And like I said, this is not the only book on slavery that I have, but it's the book I'm starting with today because there's a lot of good information in it. And yes, this is a book that was written by a white man. Okay, but that really is beside the point because the data in it is legitimate. What's being said in it can't really be refuted. Okay, and it's arguably one of the best books on slavery I've ever written. And I've read, not, I'm sorry, I wish I'd written this. One of the best books on slavery I've ever read. Okay, not the only one, like I said, but it's up there in terms of what you will read in it that will open your eyes to this whole history that has literally never been told. So, let us begin. And I'm going to give the pages. So, as I start this, I'm reading from the introduction because there's a whole chapter. I'm going to break down each chapter. I'm not going to not like go into detail about each chapter, but I'm going to tell you the title of each chapter and basically the gist of what each chapter details. Okay, but I'm going to start out in the introduction chapter. Okay, and the book starts out with a story about a man named Charles Mallory. Okay, now Charles Mallory was a slave owner. Okay, and in 1861, in May of 1861, Charles Mallory, this slave owner, approached Fortress Monroe in Virginia. Okay, it was a Union fort. And it was their last really foothold in the Virginia territory. Okay. And he approached this fort to demand the return of some runaway slaves that he literally called contraband. You see, this is what they referred to our people as, our ancestors as during this time period. This is how objectified we were during this time. They called us contraband when we would run away. You know, we think of contraband as the illegal import of goods. They used words and phrases that objectified black people that made us akin to a good. We were something to be traded. So he came to this fort in 1861 demanding his contraband because what was happening was because of the Civil War, a lot of slaves were fleeing the plantations. And they were trying to get into different Union-controlled areas. All right, and so this fort, there were some runaway slaves in this fort. And I guess somehow Charles Mallory found out about it. And basically, to make a long story short, he didn't get what he went there for. They basically rejected him. Okay, they told him to hit the road, basically. Okay, but when Kanye West says that slavery was a choice, it completely whitewashes the hell. It whitewashes look, I'm trying to. I'm not going to say certain words because I do want children to be able to watch this video. You know what I'm saying? So I don't want it to be laced with profanity. But he whitewashes the hell out of slave rebellions, out of runaway slaves who used the Underground Railroad and other means to escape servitude. Okay, and that's what this book goes into detail with. This book and other books like it. American history is littered with examples of resistance to slavery by black people. Whether you were talking about people who were on the plantation or people who got away from the plantation and became abolitionists, people like Frederick Douglass and other people like him. Henry Highland Garnett and other people like him. So this notion that just because black people had to stay, were forced through the threat of death, were forced to stay on plantations, okay, that they just decided willy-nilly to not do anything is just extremely ignorant. Because even the people who stayed on the plantation had forms of resistance. But let me actually read this passage to you. And I quote from the book, those first three, quote, contrabands struck a crack in slavery's centuries-old wall. Over the next 4 years, get this, over the next 4 years, hundreds of thousands more enslaved people widened the crack into a gaping breach by escaping to the Union lines or escaping across Union lines. But Kanye West wants you to believe black people just chose slavery because they liked it for some dumb mess he's on right now. But let me continue. Their movement weakened the Confederate war effort and made it easier for the United States and its president to avow mass emancipation as a tool of war. Eventually, the Union Army began to welcome formerly enslaved men into its ranks. We already know this about the story of the 54th Massachusetts and black soldiers who fought with the Union during the Civil War, which the Union wouldn't have won that war without black people, by the way. Turning refugee camps into recruiting stations because there were so many black people who were running away from the plantation during the Civil War. You had these refugee camps, and these Union soldiers were like, oh, dang, let's just start recruiting these guys. We can put these guys onto the front lines. And those African American soldiers would make the difference. It is a white man writing this. Would make the difference between victory and defeat for the North, which by late 1863 was exhausted and uncertain. The North was, by all accounts, the North was getting its butt whooped. The South had better generals. The South had better military tactics, all of the good generals in the U.S. military at the breakout of the Civil War, they all went to the South. The Union had the more inexperienced soldiers, the more inexperienced generals. The Union was losing battle after battle after battle. They were worn out and exhausted. But because these black men and women, but the women weren't being put onto the battlefield, obviously, and they shouldn't have been, but because of these black men and women fleeing the plantation in the 1860s, this single-handedly, I guess I shouldn't say single-handedly, but this had a huge role to play in everything that happened afterwards. But let me continue. I'm going to skip down a little bit. Okay? All of this history is very important because there's a concerted effort historically, and this has been going on for generations. There's been a concerted effort to sanitize and whitewash the history of slavery. And there's a passage in the book that explains this. It says, by the 1930s, most white Americans had been demanding for decades that they hear only sanitized versions of the past, into which Lorenzo Ivy had been born. Lorenzo Ivy, in the book, he explains Lorenzo Ivy was a black man who had been born into slavery. And what happened was the author of the book, The Half Has Never Been Told, he's retelling this story from the 1930s about how the WPA, which was set up by the Roosevelt administration, the Works Progress Administration. Yeah, that was part of the New Deal, right? So the WPA, they hired people to go around and catalog the history of slavery from former slaves, because a lot of them were still alive during this time period. They were extremely old, but they were still alive. And they had a story to tell. And this story clashed, with the sanitized version of slavery that people wanted to hear. Okay, it says this might seem strange, but in the middle of the 19th century, white Americans had gone to war with each other over the future of slavery in their country, and slavery had lost. Indeed, for a few years after 1865, many white Northerners celebrated emancipation as one of their collective triumphs. Okay, yet whites' belief in the emancipation made permanent by the 13th Amendment, much less in the race-neutral citizenship, they believed in that much less in the race-neutral citizenship that the 14th and 15th Amendment had written into the Constitution. And that was never that deep. Their belief in those things, according to this white author, had never been that deep. Okay? Within half a century after Butler, within half a century after Charles Mallory left that fortress, Fortress Monroe, empty-handed, the children of white Union and Confederate soldiers united against African American political and civil equality. This compact of white supremacy enabled Southern whites to impose Jim Crow segregation on public space, disenfranchise African American citizens by barring them from the polls, and use the lynch mob noose to enforce black compliance. Okay? I'm skipping around here. Give me 1 second. So now he goes into more, in the book, he goes into more of a discussion. I'm still in the introduction, by the way. He goes into more of a discussion about the whitewashing of this history, which is something that Kanye West, unfortunately, is engaged in right now. But to an openly racist historical profession and a white history reading, history thinking public obsessed with all kinds of race control, the white South's desire to whitewash slavery in the past and maintain segregation now and forever served the purpose of validating control over supposedly pre-modern, semi-savage black people. That was the context by which the whitewashing of history was echoed. Okay? And I'm going to read one last passage, then I'm going to move on to the next. Such stories about slavery shaped the questions. Claude Anderson, who was the WPA representative in 1930, who was going around cataloging some of the slave narratives and things like that. He said such stories about slavery shaped the questions Claude Anderson was about to ask in the 1930s, because you could find openly racist versions of it baked into the recipe of every American textbook. You could find it in the popular novels, politician speeches, plantation nostalgia advertising, and even the first blockbuster American film, Birth of a Nation. As President Woodrow Wilson, a Southern-born history professor, called his paean or something like that to white supremacy, his ode, I guess you can say. Let me repeat this. As President Woodrow Wilson, a Southern-born history professor, called his ode to white supremacy, quote, history written with lightning. That's what he referred to Birth of a Nation as. And screamed it at the White House. Such ideas became soaked into the American way of, into the way America publicly depicted slavery. Even many of those who believed that they rejected overt racism depicted the era before emancipation as a plantation idol of happy slaves and paternalist masters. Abolitionists were snakes in the garden, responsible for a civil war in which hundreds of thousands of white people died. Maybe the end of slavery had come for the South to achieve economic modernity, but it didn't have to come that way, they said. All right? So what we are seeing right now in 2018, you would think stuff like this that was going on in the 1920s, 1930s, this time period. You would think stuff like this is part of a relic of the past, right? I'm sure a lot of people think that. Oh, this is just stuff that happened in the past. But no, the whitewashing of slavery continues into the modern era, into 2018. When you say slavery is a choice, you are whitewashing the truth. You are putting yourself, or Kanye is putting himself in line with some of the most racist drivel from the past, where they literally tried to I'm not even talking about Birth of a Nation. Think about movies like what was that movie called? Gone with the Wind. I don't know how many people have seen Gone with the Wind, but if you've seen Gone with the Wind, you know that it depicted this sort of idyllic plantation life, this complete false fantasy that slaves were just these. Oh yes, boss. Slaves were like these happy-go-lucky, wide-eyed, buck dancing, celebratory, whatever. Like that black people were just happy slaves. This myth was very popular. And we're going to see as I continue with this and reading this book, we're going to tell you why that. I'm going to tell you why that is. Because they don't want you to know how much money they made off of the backs of black people. They don't want you to know how much this country wouldn't even be the country it is today if it weren't for the free labor of black people. Okay, so the whitewashing of slavery is tied to the denial of reparations. But I'm getting ahead of myself. So let me talk for a second about some of the major erroneous assumptions about slavery. Continuing with this whitewashing of slavery and this whitewashing of history, this selective history that people like to echo, let me continue with this. Okay, and I'm still in the introduction, by the way. The half has never been told. This is the introduction. The first major assumption is that as an economic system, a way of producing and trading commodities, American slavery was fundamentally different from the rest of the modern economy and separate from it. That's an assumption. It is an assumption to separate slavery from the modern economy. But that's what people want to do. And that is very deliberate. This perspective implies not only that slavery didn't change, but that slavery and enslaved African Americans had little long-term influence on the rise of the United States during the 19th century, a period in which the nation went from being a minor European trading partner to becoming the world's largest economy. One of the central stories of American history. Okay, so by disassociating slavery from the economy, from the wealth accumulation of the American government, you are displacing the role that slavery played in the 19th century, in the 1800s, of propelling America to being one of the largest economies, the largest economy in the world, because of cotton. Let me continue. Hold on one second. Hold on one second, family. I'm making sure this stream is still going strong. It looked like it just cut off a second ago. Hold on. All right. So yeah, let me continue. The second major assumption is that slavery in the United States was fundamentally in contradiction with the political and economic systems of the liberal republic. Let me repeat that. The second major assumption is that slavery in the United States was fundamentally in contradiction or opposed to the political and economic systems of the liberal republic. When in fact they were tied together, they were very closely aligned. The third assumption, let me recap before I go to the third one. So you had the first assumption, which was the assumption that slavery was separate from the burgeoning of the American economy. Then you had the second assumption, which was that slavery was opposed to or separate from the political economic systems of this liberal republic of America, which that's also false. But then the third assumption, the worst thing about slavery as an experience one is told, was that it denied enslaved African Americans the liberal rights and liberal subjectivity of modern citizens. It did those things as a matter of course and as injustice. That denial ranks with the greatest in modern history. But slavery also killed people in large numbers. From those who survived, it stole everything. Yet the massive and cruel engineering required to rip 1 million people from their homes, brutally drive them to new disease-ridden places, and make them live in terror, in racial terror, that's my wording, and in hunger as they continually built and rebuilt a commodity-generating empire. This vanished in the story of a slavery that was supposedly focused primarily not on producing profit, which is what they don't want to talk about, but on maintaining its status as a quasi-feudal elite or producing modern ideas about race in order to maintain white unity and elite power. And once the violence of slavery was minimized, another voice could whisper, saying that African Americans both before and after emancipation were denied the rights of citizens because they wouldn't fight for them. That goes back to what Kanye, that goes back to what Kanye's saying. That black people didn't have what we needed because we just didn't fight hard enough. As if we had the means to do more. All these assumptions lead to still more implications, ones that shape attitudes, identities, and debates about policy. This is why this is so important. This is why I push back when people say, "Well, no, this is just somebody's opinion. He's using his free thought." No. Assumptions influence attitudes, identities, and debates about policy. When you assume that slavery is a choice and you're doing it to get into the good graces of a president who likes to surround himself with white supremacists, and a president who's already using Kanye's words against the black community, that could shape policy. If slavery was outside of U.S. history, for instance, then slavery was not implicated in U.S. growth. So understand what he's saying. He's saying if you disassociate slavery from U.S. history, then you cannot say it was slavery that was responsible for the growth of the United States. Okay, so this growth in success, power, and wealth, when you disassociate slavery from the growth of America, you disassociate slavery from the success of America, the power of America, and the wealth of America. Therefore, none of the massive quantities of wealth and treasure piled by that economic growth is owed to African Americans. Do y'all see how that works? Do you see how that works? The whitewashing of slavery is about denying the role that slavery played in creating American power, international wealth, and the entire success of America after slavery. And yet people say black people shouldn't get reparations. People say there's no argument for reparations. What? Do you know history? Do you understand what's going? Do you understand with the amount of wealth that was accumulated because of slavery? Clearly a lot of people don't. And that's a problem. Because when people don't understand what's going on, when people don't understand what the role that slavery played in creating this society, it opens the door for assumptions that are unhistoric and problematic. But let me continue. Surely, if the worst thing about slavery was that it denied African Americans the liberal rights of the citizens, if that's all slavery was about, was just, black people not having rights, which that certainly was part of it, but if that's what we narrow it down to, one must merely offer them the title of citizen, even elect a black president to make amends. Then the issue will be put to rest forever. You see how that works? If all you say is, okay, well, slavery was just about black people not having rights and not about black people financially, not about the wealth that black people created for America, which people want to deny. They wanted to deny it in 1930 and they want to deny it in 2018. Then it becomes an issue. Well, okay, well, once they pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, once they pass civil rights legislation, once we get a black president, what do you hear people saying now? Oh, you guys had a black president. Why are you still complaining? Because we've laid a foundation where that's the only way they view themselves, as having to amend for what's been done. The entire history of wealth accumulation, of economics, and the money that was made from slavery, that doesn't even get brought up. But we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about why slavery wasn't a choice today. We're going to talk about why slaves would have their body parts cut off and be whipped for running away. We're going to talk about that today. Because when you have the largest economy in the world because of cotton production, you will do everything, even murder slaves, to maintain that wealth. Let me continue. Slavery's story gets told in ways that reinforce all these assumptions. Textbooks segregate 25 decades of enslavement into one chapter. Damn, like it's not even a black man saying this. Like, this is stuff that black people say all the time. Textbooks segregate 25 decades of enslavement into one chapter. So you're supposed to understand the full extent of slavery and what slavery did to America and what slavery did to the minds of black people in one chapter. It would take books entire books, hundreds of pages long, to really get the full grasp. And not even the full grasp. We're getting like pieces. We're getting pieces of the story. You have to read 5, 10 different books, all right, to get a holistic picture. But the American education system thinks that you can narrow this down to 1 or 2 chapters. And you wonder why you have fools like Kanye West running around saying slavery was a choice. Seems like I remember a book being written by a great man one time. Okay, a book called The Miseducation of the Negro. That miseducation continues, family, to this day. Millions of people each year, check this out. Millions of people each year visit plantation homes where guides blather about furniture and silverware. Like that's another thing. Like okay, so you might say, okay, maybe slave plantations still have some sort of historic value, all right, but the fact that you have slave plantations and tours of slave plantations where our ancestors used to get whipped and raped and all this other crazy mess, and you have these tour guides going around talking about, yeah, look at this sofa, look at this silverware, yada yada yada. Okay, I digress. Let me continue. As sites, such homes hide the real purpose of these places. He's talking about the slave plantations that are now tourist attractions, to use as tourist attractions today. Which was to make African Americans toil under the hot sun for the profit of the rest of the world. Let me repeat that. The purpose of a slave plantations were concentration camps. The purpose of a slave plantation was like a colonial factory. A plantation was a colonial factory. The purpose of which was to create mountains of profit for the rest of the world, not just America. Because when that cotton was picked in the American South, it made its way to Europe. It made its way to the UK. It made its way to Germany, where Germans and British people and other people around Europe traded these goods, traded these quote-unquote Negro cloths, as they call them. These Negro shirts from America. They traded these low quality, these low cost shirts, cotton shirts and cotton clothes. Cotton was also used for ships, too, by the way. They traded all of this stuff for their own profit. So you had people in Europe making a buck off of the backs of black Americans. But they don't want to have a discussion about this. You will not see this written in any grade school K through 12 textbook. But slavery was a choice, according to the great sage known as Kanye West. All of this was symbolic annihilation of enslaved people, as two scholars of those weird places put it. Meanwhile, they said scholars of the weird places. He's talking about the plantations, people who do like tours of plantations and stuff. They call it symbolic annihilation of enslaved people. Just going around touring these plantations like on some happy-go-lucky stuff. But anyway. Meanwhile, at other points, we tell slavery's story by heaping praise on those who escaped it through flight or death in rebellion. So we praise the we rightfully praise the rebels, the people who got out of slavery, but we leave the listener to wonder if those who didn't flee or died somehow, quote, accepted slavery. That is literally what Kanye West said. Kanye West is that listener. Kanye West is that listener who believes that just because people didn't die, essentially, and didn't want to die, so they stayed on the plantation, that they did that because they wanted to be there. They just accepted slavery. I refuse to believe that. And anybody who studies this history and studies slave rebellions, not necessarily rebellions, but studies forms of resistance that actually occurred on plantations, not outside of plantations, but on plantations, anybody who studies this knows that that's not true. So let me see where we are. Hold on one second. I'm still here, family. Give me 1 second. I'm just checking a few things out. Okay, so here we go. So, slaves did flee. They escaped and many attempted to fight back through slave rebellions. Okay, people know this, but what's going on here is the story of how a black man, and sadly others like him, buy into alt-right, right wing, which is nothing more than old school white supremacy, revisionist history. So I'm skipping ahead. Give me 1 second. I'm just looking over my notes, seeing where I want to actually pick up the next parts. I'm still here. I'm just looking through the book because there's a lot of information here. Like, family, there's so much information. This book, like, I have notes, just pages of notes on this book. Like that's how much I broke this down. Like, y'all gotta, and for those who might be listening now, who weren't listening at first, the book is called the history. The half has never been told: Slavery and the History of American Capitalism. I have pages of notes on this book, like stuff that I wrote like a long time ago, not even necessarily for today's show, but I pulled out these notes because I was like, okay, I got to break down the history of this. So I said at the beginning of the show that I'm gonna roughly, very quickly go over each chapter of the book. Now, bear with me for 1 second. This is gonna take like 2 minutes. Okay. The first chapter of the book is called Feet, and it deals with the unfree movement on paths to enslaved frontiers that were laid down between the end of the American Revolution in 1783 in the early 1800s. In this chapter, he goes into how some of the first steps taken into the new territories of America were steps taken by slaves. Gangs of thousands of slaves who walked from states like because they weren't being given horses, and of course they didn't have trains and cars doing this. They walked slaves from state to state to state to these new territories. So that's what that chapter is about. The chapter 2 is called Heads, which covers the America's acquisition of the key points of the Mississippi Valley by violence, a gain that also consolidated the enslavers' hold on the frontier. Okay, then come the two chapters that I think are the most important. So one of these chapters I'm going to focus on the most today, and that's called The Right Hand and the Left Hand. This is chapters 3 and 4. They reveal the inner secrets of the enslavers' power. Their secrets which made the entire world of white people wealthy. I'm going to focus on on chapter 3 for the rest of today's show. Then you have chapters tongues and breath, seed, blood, backs, and arms. Okay. This book goes into some slave rebellions. It goes into the origin of a lot of newspapers, and while a lot of the first black newspapers, which I talked about in the video and the article I wrote about the importance of independent black media. Okay, independent black media has its origins in abolition and fighting against slavery. Okay, that's like some of the first stuff. That's some of the first stuff we were talking about for the obvious reasons. Okay, but let me see if there's anything else from this chapter that I want to go over. I don't think there is. I do want to mention one thing very quickly. This is on the second to the last page of the introduction. I want to talk about the stock market. Okay, and the slave origins of the stock market. Okay? With the creation of innovative financial tools, more and more of the Western world was able to invest directly in slavery's expansion. So let me stop right there. When you get people who say things like, well, my ancestors didn't own slaves, you can't blame me for that. My ancestors didn't own slaves. It wasn't about owning slaves. Physically owning a slave was only part of the financial incentives for slavery. You could invest in slaves. You can invest in slave stocks. We all know, well, some of us know that Wall Street started as a slave, like they were selling slaves on Wall Street. The origins of the American stock market is based in slave stocks. Let me continue. Such creativity multiplied the incredible productivity and profitability of enslaved people's labor and allowed enslavers to turn bodies into commodities with which they changed the financial history of the Western world. And this book goes into this, like I said, this is just the introduction. This book spends in like an entire chapters just talking about banks. The U.S. banking system and how much the U.S. banking system owes to slavery. How much U.S. banks owe to slavery and how much wealth they accumulated because of slavery. But I digress on that one thing. But I just wanted to read that one highlighted passage that I had in the book. So I'm going to skip to page 75. All right? I'm skipping to page 75. And I'm going to cover as much as I possibly can. I was going to read passages from the chapter left hand, which is chapter 4. But I think today I'm going to stick it with the right hand, okay, which is chapter 3. This chapter deals with the time period between 1815 and 1819. Okay, and for the sake of discussion, chapter 4, left hand, deals with the years between 1805 and 1861, but I might run out of time. Honestly, I probably will run out of time, and I won't have time to really delve into chapter 4 too much. But I'm really gonna break down chapter 3 though. So give me 1 second. I'm getting my notes in order. So let's see. So on page 77, the stuff I'm about to read is going to be between pages 77 and pages 83, 77 and 83. So at the beginning of Right Hand, chapter 3, the author of the book, who, by the way, I don't think I mentioned his name. His name was Edward Baptiste, or his name is Edward Baptiste, or Baptist. Each chapter, he goes into the story of a particular slave. So he's at the beginning of this chapter, he talks about a slave, a woman, a black woman by the name of Rachel, who was originally from my hometown of Baltimore, but she was sold to a slave owner in Louisiana, and she made her way to, or she was basically ferried to New Orleans. Okay, we're gonna get into the wealth. We're gonna get into the money. Okay, the money that is owed, quite frankly, to black people. Okay, so let me see where I want to start. Okay, so let me start here. If Rachel could have followed the bale, talking about the bale of cotton that slaves pick, because he's talking about how Rachel is watching these transactions. She's watching how these bales of cotton are being loaded onto slave ships. Well, not slave ships, but trading ships, trading vessels, to be taken to other parts of the world. So it says, if Rachel could have followed the bale, she'd have seen it loaded from the levee onto ongoing sea vessels. These would carry the bales across the Atlantic Ocean to Liverpool on England's northwestern coast, where dock workers moved the bales into warehouses. So it's going from New Orleans to Liverpool. Once it gets to Liverpool, the bales of cotton sit in warehouses. After sale on the Liverpool cotton market, so you have people in England making money off of cotton picked by black American slaves. After the sales on the Liverpool cotton market, they went by canal barge to Manchester's new mills. British textile workers, often former operators of hand-powered looms or displaced farm workers, they opened the bales. Using new machines, they spun the clean cotton fibers into thread. Using other machines, they wove that thread into long pieces of cloth. Liverpool shipped the boats of finished cloth, and they found their way into almost every city or town in the known world, including this one. So that's the trajectory. New Orleans to Liverpool, cotton picked in the American South, transported to Liverpool as raw cotton. That raw cotton is sold on British markets, cotton markets. After it's sold on the cotton markets, it's transported to Manchester, where British workers in factories turn that unthreaded cotton into clothes. It goes back to Liverpool as a finished product, and it's sold all over the world, including back to America. Profit on top of profit on top of profit. Capitalism is a MFer. I'll just say it like that. for to keep it as clean as possible. Cotton cloth is why New Orleans, this is from the book, page 77. Cotton cloth is why New Orleans was booming. why the world was changing. All right? This boom, this cotton boom, was changing the world's future. And these white entrepreneurs who used Rachel, a black woman, a slave, were establishing themselves and their kind as one of the most powerful groups in the modernizing Western world that cotton was making. Okay, there was a reason why you had that saying, cotton is king. You had an entire generations of wealth that came from cotton production. And again, it's not just from the trading. It's not people get caught up in the owning of slaves. It was not just about owning slaves. It was about how everybody profited off of this system. The title of today's show is The System of Slavery. It was the system that people benefited from, not just the owning of a slave. That was only one part of the process. There was a whole system here. There was a whole process to this. So you might say, yeah, my ancestors didn't own slaves. Well, did your ancestors own slave stock? You might not know. You might not know whether they did or they didn't. But I guarantee you this, a lot more people owned slave stocks than actually owned slaves. And that gave them a vested interest in seeing that system maintained. Come on, y'all. I feel like I'm in church right now. But let's continue. Let me continue. So the book between pages 77 and 83, he goes into, I'm not going to read all of this. He goes into the Industrial Revolution a little bit and how important cotton production was to the Industrial Revolution. And there's a chart on page 80 about something showing the Great Divergence, which is basically when you had an explosion of wealth because of the Industrial Revolution, of which cotton was integral. Okay, like I said, I'm not gonna read all of this because, like I said, it's way too much information. Okay, but I'm going to pick up here. So it says, but the move from arithmetical to geometric economic growth wasn't only caused by the greater efficiency of British machines. Okay, all the new efficiencies, all of the accelerating curves of growth would have been short-circuited if the embryo industries had run out of cotton fiber. So he's basically saying if cotton disappeared, this growth would have just gone away. And that nearly happened. But it says before 1800, most of the cotton fiber, came from small-scale production in India, from the Caribbean, and from Brazil. Okay? But by 1819, this is on page 82. By 1819, the rapid expansion of Mississippi Valley slave labor camps had enabled the United States to seize control of the world export market for cotton, the most crucial of the early industrial commodities. America basically cornered the market in cotton production because we had so many slaves, we had so much land purely just dedicated to cotton production. We cornered the market, or we didn't do anything. America cornered the market. And cotton became the dominant driver of U.S. economic growth. Y'all gonna trip out when I tell you this in a second. Listen to this. By 1820, cotton accounted for 42% of all U.S. exports. By 1820, cotton that black people picked accounted for 42% of all U.S. exports. But, but there's nothing to talk about when it comes to reparations. This is heavy. Like, I'm sitting here, like, as I'm reading this to you guys, it's like on the one hand, I'm like, I'm just reading the information verbatim from the book. But on the other hand, I'm sitting here just thinking about the magnitude of the physical, mental, and emotional stress that my ancestors were put through to create this amount of wealth for white people, mostly white men. But wealth that was passed down through generation after generation after generation. This wealth didn't just go anywhere. This wealth didn't just disappear after slavery. That's what people have to understand. This wealth was passed down. And honestly, continues to be passed down to this day in various ways. Man, this is heavy. So this I want to pick up on page 85. Okay, because the chapter 3 right hand, it goes into the story of a man named Vincent Nolte. Now, Vincent Nolte was a slave-owning capitalist backed by the Bank of England. Okay? He was backed by the Bank of England. You had the entire banking system behind slavery. They don't tell you this. Where do you think the money came from to do all of this? Honestly, if you really stop to think for a second, where do you think the capital came from to finance this system? To finance the system of slavery? It came from banks. Okay, so Vincent Nolte, like I said, a slave-owning capitalist, he basically engineered the cotton trade in New Orleans. He was one of the most influential slave owners of the time period. So I'm about to explain to you guys, and I'm going to end the stream. But over the next 20 minutes or so, I'm going to explain to you guys who Nolte was. I'm going to explain to you guys what I mean by right-handed power, or what you might be able to call right-wing power. The credit system, and the origin of the credit. Well, no, I wouldn't say the origin, but in the American context, the importance of the credit system to slavery, and the banking system profiting off of slavery. So I'm about to cram a bunch of stuff into the next 20 minutes. So just hear me out. We almost done today's stream. So, no single man, this is page 85, no single man was more influential in shaping the New Orleans cotton trade into the world's biggest one than Vincent Nolte. He first came at the behest of the Anglo-Dutch firm Hope and Company before 1812, bringing 500,000 pounds in paper backed by the Bank of England. I didn't even look to see how much money that would be in today's dollars, but £500,000 in 1812 sounds like a ton of money today in today's money. I mean, so, but let me continue. Um, like I said, backed by the Bank of England. With this stake, he built a circuit of cotton and capital. A circuit of cotton and capital between the old world and the new. After the War of 1812 ended, he linked up with the Baring brothers, the massive London commercial bank that had financed the U.S. purchase of Louisiana. All right? And whose pressure had convinced American and British negotiators to swallow pride and sign the Treaty of Ghent at the end of 1814. So, yeah, it's going into that. Baring's money, the money from these brothers, the Baring brothers, or the bank, that was the name of the bank. Their money allowed Nolte to accumulate huge piles of cotton on the levee after 1815. And by 1819, he was buying 20,000 to 40,000 bales per year. 4 to 8% of U.S. exports and up to a quarter of what passed through New Orleans. The huge quantities of money he channeled from Britain into this room at Maspero's, which Maspero's was like a coffee. It was like the Starbucks of its time in New Orleans. So he funneled money from Britain through this coffee house, okay, and stimulated cotton production along the river valleys that fed New Orleans. Nolte's modernization of the trade incidentally made it both the more efficient and more open to new players. So it allowed new people to come into the game. He gathered and disseminated information about the state of the Mississippi Valley markets by creating a printed circular that quoted the going price for all sorts of good in New Orleans. All right. Let me skip down. Because I'm trying to cut down on time. So let me go into some of his influence. It says Nolte's actions spurred economic modernization, even more efficient exploitation of ever greater amounts of resources by stimulating the production of enormous quantities of cotton. It says they are architects of the dynamic, quote, creative destruction. Okay, that iconoclastic economist Joseph, I can't pronounce his last name, identified as the core engine of capitalism's growth. Okay, so he's saying Nolte used this dynamic of creative destruction, okay, a core engine of capitalism's growth, which was basically slavery. Creative destruction produces retching shocks, devastating depressions following dramatic expansions. Okay, wars and conquests and enslavements. So here in New Orleans, cotton and slaves enable creative destruction to produce the modern economy. So we're tying together capitalism with slavery with white supremacy. But it was a choice. Black people could just willy-nilly just choose not to be slaves. Hold on 1 second. I'm getting these daggone messages. Give me 1 second. Let me put my phone on mute. All right, there we go. So we're talking about creative destruction, which was the tactic that Vincent Nolte, the capitalistic tactic that Vincent Nolte utilized. Okay, and then I already told you that they brought cotton from the interior and shipped it to Liverpool. So I already mentioned that. I had that underlined, but I already mentioned that. In other words, they made a market, the cotton market, one that, though centered in the lower Mississippi Valley, that's where it was centered, this market, this cotton market stretched far beyond this specific place to creep tendrils of incentive reaching into Maryland farms, Alabama cotton docks, New York banks, and London parlors. This slave market would continue to develop over the next 4 decades in dynamic relationship with the development of the cotton economy. So now, that was pages 85 to 87. Now this is the last part of the stream. I just want to read this to you, then I'm going to be done for today. Okay, this is way too much to go into, and I'm going to let this marinate right here. Okay. The author of the book, Edward Baptist, he says, quote, the great 20th century theologian Robert Farrar Capon called, quote, right-handed power, which is the title of this chapter, chapter 3. He called right-handed power, what I call today right-wing power, the strength to force an outcome. Capone identified right-handed power. Oh no, well let me not read that. Let me just say the strength to force an outcome. Right-handed power is the power of domination, kings, weapons, and the letter of the law. That's why I said right wing. The author of the book, Edward Baptist, is calling it right-handed power because that's what this theologian Robert Farrar Capon, that's what he called it. I'm calling it right-wing power to put a contemporary spin on it. Right-handed power, like I said, is the power of domination, weapons, and the letter of the law. They got more guns and bullets. Okay. Now let me read this. In the early 19th century, so the 1800s, those right-handed societies and individuals who were winning in the sorting out of power and state accumulated unprecedented right-handed strength. They got more guns and bullets. You're talking about guns in the Second Amendment in America. We cannot deny the role that gun ownership plays in maintaining this right-handed power. This domination of black people and other groups of people as well. They got more guns and bullets, more soldiers, the ability to knock down other people's defenses and force them to trade on the terms more favorable to the West. Right-handed power was increasingly distributed in a lopsided fashion. Members of the new leading classes, people like the men at Maspero's, that New Orleans Starbucks from the 1800s that I was telling you about, but also the cotton mill owning classes of Manchester, the merchants of New York, the bankers of London, got most of that power into their hands. So if one had to pick the hand to which letter writers referred as they sat there at Maspero's, one might say right, quote unquote. Even though the effects of entrepreneurs' decisions sometimes played out a long way from the places where the decisions were taken. They were still straight line effects. The letter is written and sent. And so this is the chain of events. Check this out. The letter is written and sent. The Maryland trading partner reads it, deposits the bill of exchange, goes to the probate auction, buys a woman advertised as a house servant or a house slave, and takes her to the next Louisiana-bound ship. So the exchanges of the cotton economy, wrote one white man, quote, to whom Louisiana successes, he said he had given, quote, a new sense of independence. So you have white men at the time writing about the power that this gave them. Okay? It put this power into their hands. This white man from Louisiana during the time, he said he told a relative it could, quote, enrich yourself. A man presses a button with his right index finger on a machine of the trading world with its new markets and opportunities, and things happen to benefit him. Things involving sterling bills, a huge pile of cotton, or a long roster of slaves. The emerging modern world strengthened the right hands of these men. The domination, going back to what it means to be the right-handed power, the domination, the letter of the law and order, as you hear people say today. Whenever you hear people say law and order, that is right-handed power. That is the power of tyrants. That is the power of oppression. That is the power of racial domination. And here's the part about credit. This is the part that is key. Much of the muscular power in the right hands was nerved by credit. Itself a phenomenon almost as magical seeming as the idea that one could direct far off events with one's hands. And then I have this underlined: credit is belief. Credit equals belief. The word comes from the Latin credere, okay, that brings value today in exchange for a promise to pay in the future. Credit brings value today. It is the belief that you have value today basically on an IOU, a promise to pay in the future. Credit allowed entrepreneurs and others to spend tomorrow's money today, accomplishing trades and investments that would, the borrower believed, make more wealth tomorrow. Credit was what allowed trade to spread, to move smoothly, and to enrich people around the Atlantic basin. You had an entire credit system built on slavery. All right? The link between the cotton field and politics can be found in the strange alchemy of banks. I want to get into the banking system. Okay? And the role that the banking system played in slavery. Everyone knows that the banks take in deposits, right? And banks lend out money. We know this. Banks provide loans. But they don't always realize that when banks make a loan, they actually create money. We call that money credit. That's why when you get a loan, that's why like bankers say you're being credited this amount of money. When you get a loan, you're being credited. That's what it's. They're creating money. They're creating money out of nothing. And we call that money credit. As we heard already, that means that the money is based on belief. The belief that the bank is going to be repaid with interest in the future. Which, of course, if you're talking about slavery and you're talking about investing in slavery, what was happening was you would have white men. I don't know if women had the ability to do this or not, but we know for a fact white men would take out these loans. They would get these loans from banks. Banks would give them, let's just say for the sake of discussion, $50. Because this was paper money, this was fiat currency. They would use that money to invest in slavery. And then from the profits that they got from slavery, they would pay they would pay the banks back with interest. So that the banks could turn around and continue, keep doing that process over and over and over again. Okay? New Orleans entrepreneur William Kenner, for instance, could use bills of exchange, dollar bills, promises to pay IOUs that originated with a British merchant firm to buy cotton bales from his slave owner partner named John Minor. So you would have entrepreneurs who might not have even owned slaves. They would get loans to buy bales of cotton from slave owners. Okay, and then the entrepreneur Kenner could then ship the bales to Liverpool and sell them there to a merchant house, which would in turn credit, there's that word again, which would in turn credit Kenner, the entrepreneur's account, and redeem the bills of exchange from the original firm. The merchant house could allow Kenner, the entrepreneur, to draw on his account, to take out loans on his account by writing checks or drafts. It could also, if its partners believed in Kenner's financial future, the entrepreneur's financial future. So if the slave owners believed Kenner was a good man to bet on, they would allow him to write his own notes of hand and negotiate them in the United States, using them as his source of credit. Kenner could then go to Maspero's, that Starbucks coffee house in New Orleans. This entrepreneur could then take these notes that he's just writing himself based on beliefs, various people believing he's gonna pay them back. He could take that to Maspero's and trade it for goods or people. If the seller believed that the Liverpool firm would honor Kenner's hand. So you see how this network worked. This was a network. How much the person accepting the note of hand believed in it, or how much he or she credited its magic, determined not only whether or not she would accept it as money, or he would accept it as money, but also how much money one believed it to be. Bills traded at a, quote, discount on the face value of the note. A floating value, a discount was a floating value that also served as an interest rate. So it's saying the bills, the slave bills, these bills that were being traded, okay, by people. This is why I call it the stock market. These bills that were being traded at a discount on the face value of the note was based on a floating value, which also served as the interest rate. So he gives an example. The author of Baptist gives an example. He says one might give $96 for a bill that could then, in 6 months, be exchanged for $100. One has just lent and been repaid at an 8% annual interest, in other words. The buying and selling of promises to pay was itself a business. Vincent Nolte, his newspaper advertisements proclaimed his willingness to buy on exchange in Paris, New York, or London. So let me repeat this. Vincent Nolte's newspaper advertisements proclaimed his willingness to buy, quote, exchange on Paris, New York, or London, notes that were payable in those cities, which Nolte could send to pay his own bills there. But belief and credit must be created. People must come to trust in its institutions and in the reliability of their trading partners in order for credit to spring into life as money and serve as fuel for explosive growth. So then it gets into the Second Bank of the United States, the BUS. It gets into a lot of stuff. At some point in time, I have to end it though. And I choose to end it there. And I'm going to end it on this. Slavery wasn't a choice because there was too much money involved in it. Slaves weren't given a choice because white supremacists and slave owners who were white supremacists made too much money off of slavery. Whether you talk about the direct owning of plantations, whether you want to talk about the slave stock market and this whole credit system that they had going on, like you could have been a participant at any phase in this transaction or in these transactions. It was not just about the plantation. So you want to know why they were killing our ancestors? It was because of hatred, yes. But until we start to talk about the financial gain that the entire country and the entire world benefited from slavery, we're not really having an accurate discussion. We're not having a full discussion. And when you have people who, in their effort to make a buck themselves and in the effort to make their own money and like I said at the beginning of the stream, gaslight the black community for their own profit, they're doing this for a specific agenda. Whether you want to say it's because of mental health, whether you want to say it's because because of the loss of his mother, whether you want to say it's a marketing ploy because he has a new album coming out, this is our history. And if we honor our history, then we will not allow our history to be told in a false, misleading way. So as bad as a lot of people don't want to talk about this, and as bad as a lot of people want to forget this, and forget that this stuff happened, you can't do that. Because the moment you forget, the moment they will come in and rewrite your history and say that no, we weren't profiting, we didn't make all of this money off of slavery. The American economy and the growth of the American economy didn't have anything to do with slavery. The moment you forget where you came from, The moment you forget where you came from is the moment you allow outsiders to come in and completely whitewash everything that your ancestors went through, but then also what their ancestors benefit from. We have to take this very seriously. A lot of people talk about having a code, right? You hear that a lot. Having a code, being on code. If part of that code isn't maintaining an accurate representation of our history, then what's the point of having a code? Our story being told accurately is integral to any type of code of conduct. Nobody's profit, nobody's pocket is more important than our history. Nobody's personal financial gain is more important than the truth of the fact that the American government, the American society, was built by us, was heavily influenced by us and our ancestors, and that this country would not be what it is today without us. And we are owed. We are owed so much that you really can't even put a number on it. Quite frankly, if I were to just throw out a number, the black community is owed trillions and trillions of dollars. Trillions. The United States government would have to go bankrupt to pay us back, which of course is not going to happen. Which is why when it comes to reparations, I'm very clear that I don't necessarily agree with financial payout. That's not the way. That's not the way by which I think it. It should be. It should be promoted, because there is no dollar amount that you can put on what our ancestors were put through. There's no dollar amount you can put on that. And if you tried to put a dollar amount on it, nobody would want to pay it. So I'm going to continue this discussion because somebody has to talk about this stuff. Somebody has to talk about what a lot of people feel uncomfortable talking about. But that's the whole purpose for Black and Intellectual. That's the whole purpose for my channel. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and end the stream now. Get prepared for the interview that I'm going to be doing in a few hours. So yeah, that's going to be the end of the stream. Check me out. I'm going to be doing episode 27. Maybe I'm going to try to do it before next week, but I'm not going to put any promises on that. But definitely part 2 is coming. I'm going to continue this discussion, and I'm going to continue this dialogue. So much that this country has, it has because of Black people. And I'm just going to leave it at that. So follow me at my Twitter at _Black Intellect. Follow my blog, www.blackandintellectual.com. And be on the lookout for that interview that I will be posting on my channel. If I don't post it today, I'll end up posting it tomorrow. But yeah, definitely be on the lookout for that as well. And have a nice day.